The reign of Bahamut. Set 2 is right around the corner, and with that said, let's figure out exactly what the meta is going to be. Hey everybody, Espira, and welcome back to another Shadowverse Evolve video. Today we're going to be doing another meta breakdown. We did do one over for the set 1 of the game's release, and now we're jumping into set 2. And this is very interesting because we're now jumping into territory where we have data from large tournaments over in Japan to actually be able to pinpoint exactly what things are going to look like. Unlike set 1, where there weren't really large tournaments running, the game had released, but then there were some product accessibility issues which lent it to being really difficult to be able to run tournaments, and generally none were hosted. However, with the introduction of set 2, we got grand opens, grand prix, something of the sort, which allows us to finally be able to get a good look at, when we're counting for large population tournaments, what exactly the metadata is showing us. And to be honest, when it comes to set 2, there's a very clear indication of where we're going. I think it's important that before we jump into what set 2 is going to look like, we take a look back at what set 1 landed, kind of what the meta was there, and then we can kind of understand where the shifts are going, and it gives us better clarity as to why things are the way that they're going to be, presumably going into set 2. So if we look at the set 1 meta, there was naturally kind of a top end of Ramp Dragon and Aggro Banner, or, mid-range Sword, even then, just kind of being at the top of meta tier 1. That being that Ramp Dragon kind of being the best thing you can do. It has some of the best top end. It can manage the board pretty well based on its different spells. And then Sword being able to get under that, or even play a mid-game game plan that allows it to be able to get under Dragon while also still having a good mid-range game plan against everything else. However, overall, this still felt like a tight tier list. And that's kind of the big theme I think we're going to be going into with set 2, where even though you have tier 2 decks in things like Earthright, D-Shift, you got Abyss Control, Amulet Control, and then you had a tier 3 Rogue, which for what's worth, Flaming Glass probably bumps up a couple of levels. I didn't do a full analysis on the end of the set 1 meta because even then metadata isn't super accessible because all the tournaments are so small and localized. But nevertheless, this is kind of the ballpark of where we're at, but it's a tight tier list. And what I mean by that is that the tier 1 is still very much playable into tier 2, into tier 3, or kind of the inverse. You're a tier 2 deck, you can take down a tournament. Your tier 3 deck, you can probably still get there anyways. We did see that there were even forest decks, which arguably might be the weakest class in set 1, still actually take down some regionals, which is great. You love to see that kind of performance from every single class. I think it's very important. This shifts largely going into set 2, however, where I think there's a bit more of a power gap. Now, I think we're still in a world where any deck can probably get there if it runs hot, but I think there's a point where we now have a kind of gatekeeper tier that keeps a lot of the other classes in the other decks away from being able to be a top deck contender when we look at the meta. So as an overall, what are we looking for in the meta of set 2? Well, effectively, you have a tier 1 and then a tier 1.5, and then I want to say tier 2 and lower. And the reason I say tier 1.5 is because they're so incredibly close to the tier 1. The problem is that you'll understand when I get into it. Tier 1 is effectively Discard Dragon, Leonidas Sword, and Abyss Aggro. They're all really good strategies that can go low to the ground, with Leonidas being a little bit more mid-range. Discard Dragon can also kind of do its thing and be a little bit more mid-rangey, but effectively be lower to the ground strategies. And why do these live at the top of the meta? Well, their card quality is incredibly good, but additionally, it's because of the existence of tier 1.5. You could call it tier 2 and shift everything to tier 3 lower, whatever. I'm just doing it at 1.5 because effectively they are incredibly good strategies that can take down tournaments. They're not just doing it as consistently as all the tier 1 decks. So we're looking at Ramp Dragon. It was best deck in format in set 1 and is still a extremely strong strategy going into set 2. And then Aegis Control for Havencraft is incredibly good, using the incredibly powerful 8-drop to be able to kind of take back control of the board. Plus you got Seraph and other tools that are incredibly good, that manage the board incredibly well and apply good pressure that your opponent can't deal with. And effectively tier 1.5, I almost feel bad putting tier numbers on these, is effectively the gatekeeper tier. This is the tier that if your deck can't beat these strategies, they will overwhelm you and they will go above and bigger than you and then take over the game, which is why tier 1 is filled with these lower the ground decks that can also kind of play a mid-range game between them in the first tier. And then tier 3 lower, you still have a lot of strategies that are there. You still have mid-range Forest or Earthright or D-Shift. Okay, all these decks kind of live in there. And I think there's a few decks even below that where it's if you're playing a Roost deck or something like that. But generally speaking, when we're looking at set 2, you're very much looking at tier 1.5 and above, and everything else needs to combat that to even have a chance. So effectively, whereas set 1 was more of a tight meta, set 2 is a much there's a much bigger valley, I would say. It's you have tier 1, you have tier 1.5, which is honestly just there, just barely. It's just results kind of don't lend it to kind of being in that same tier 1 grouping. And then you have like this massive chasm effectively between tier 1.5 and everything lower than that. So there's a bigger power disparity between kind of what the decks are doing. That's not to say other classes can't do powerful things, but in terms of where the results lean, that's what we're seeing. Now we actually have data, and I'm not, set one was very much just kind of going off of what we were able to find on the internet and just based on some locals data. Now we actually have tournaments to base off of. So if we look into 2 Grand Prix we're able to look into in set 2 to kind of give us an idea. So first we'll look at the Yokohama Grand Prix, with first place taking it down Haven Control. And no surprise there, it's an incredibly powerful strategy. It uses the Aegis that's able to stick on board. It has Seraph. And honestly, if you have a very strong day and are able to mitigate early aggro, Haven Control is an extremely good deck. I mean, this is specifically Aegis Control. Naturally, you can go into more amulet-based stuff instead. But Aegis is incredibly powerful and lends itself to a strategy that can 100% take over the board. And again, Aegis and Seraph kind of being the biggest pieces in terms of what that looks like in set 2. In the second place deck, we have Abyss Aggro, and Abyss Aggro is going to be everywhere. It was already so close to being a tier 1 strategy in set 1, but now has better lower the ground pieces. You have Soul Dealer now, which is an amazing card that can provide good stats on curve, plus is removal, plus can gain you some life, so it kind of allows you to be able to win the matchup against other aggro mid-range decks. And that's kind of the thematics that we're seeing with these lower the ground decks, is the fact that their lower the ground got a little bit better, but for the most part, when we're talking about Sword, when we're talking about Abyss Aggro, their lower the ground was already pretty good, and it's the fact that their mid-rangey pieces allow themselves to still be able to apply pressure while being decent mid-range pieces that allow you to be able to win the mid-range game, which is very important, because usually an aggro deck will lose out if it's not able to close things out by the mid game and finds itself in the late game not having kind of close the gap enough to be able to just burn out your opponent by like 1 or 2 damage. And then shifting from there, we do have Discard Dragon, which hit third. The big piece here being cards like Flute and other discard bonuses. Set 1 kind of had like inklings of cards that would work well in a Discard Dragon theme, but that has really been centralized in set 2 now to make a full coherent strategy. And I will say some of these lists aren't as fully refined as what we'll see afterwards, but again, strategy really good. Dragon not going anywhere. You can still play the ramp variants. Here it's kind of almost a hybrid. You are playing some good pieces that are super late game, like Genesis Dragon and stuff like that, but can still play pieces that lean into the early game. Now, unfortunately for this tournament, I only have the top 3, but shifting over to Kyoto, it's a whole different picture. And this is kind of where I really centralize my belief in tier 1 being these 3 decks. So if we look at the top 8 breakdown for the Kyoto Grand Prix, we have 3 classes represented, one of which is being Discard Dragon, the other being Sword Leonidas, and then Aggro Abyss, which centralizes kind of the entirety of the format. We did see Aegis Control win Yokohama, so those decks can get there and they're powerful enough to get there. But as the format moved along in Japan, it very much pushed towards these 3 decks, lower the ground decks that can also do a bit of a mid-range game, to really be the top contenders. And thankfully, we actually have those decks as well. So I'm not going to do a full breakdown of these decks. I think it'll be more proper to do full-on deck profiles of them in other videos, but at least in terms of here, to kind of give you an idea of what those are looking like, as people figure out the format and kind of tighten things up. This is where we are with the Sword Leonidas deck. Again, tightening up on that mid-range and just trying to figure out what pieces. This one playing Olivia as a 3 copy. I will say something that's interesting is that as much as Olivia is a card that sees play in quote unquote almost everything in most of the format, because she's just so incredibly good and flexible, in terms of these lower the ground lists, she doesn't see a ton of play. This winning deck list does indeed play her, and for what it's worth, I think a lot of these lists in tier 1.5, tier 2 and above will want to use them. But nevertheless, they don't all use them. If we look at this second place, Sword Leonidas does not opt to use that, instead pivots to using more mid-range pieces. Erd is a card that sees much more usage going into this format, naturally because you have a deck that the card interacts with really well with the EX area and all that, but also just because it's good removal. It's a very good flex. And then moving on from that, we've got Abyss Aggro again, just kind of doing his thing using 3 wraiths, and this one playing Bellringer, which is kind of funny. Hey, we're in an aggro format, but the aggro deck does play Bellringer because you don't want to lose to other aggro decks. So this is kind of funny back and forth. And of course, you can just use the 1 evo point to be able to remove one of your opponent's early drops, which can let you win that matchup, and then you draw cards. It's just funny that the aggro deck is playing the defense card, but nevertheless, you're still seeing more things. I will say Soul Dealer isn't a guaranteed 3 of in a lot of these decks. Sometimes they run at 2 of. In this deck, for example, it's run as a none of, but we still see cards like Cerebus see play, top play in set 1, still seeing play in set 2, and kind of is a staple for this deck. Execution Executioner is a card I absolutely love, does see a 3-of here, but again, Executioner is not a card that sees play in every single one of these aggro decks. Going into Discard Dragon, this one kind of being lower of the ground, the one that we saw over in Yokohama being more of a top end. You know, we saw the Genesis Dragons and the other cards like that being in much more bigger numbers. Here, this one being more low to the ground, still being kind of mid-rangey, not really being aggro. We see the Olivias and we see other mid-range pieces, but not as committed to that top end. Going on from there, another Sword Leonidas, and at this point, we're just kind of seeing the same thing. So if you guys are interested in any of these lists, I'm just going to go through them real quickly here so that you guys can kind of get that visibility in terms of what top 4 and top 8 look like. But at this point, there is nothing that breaks beyond the top 3 decks of tier 1 and really kind of cements where this format exists. It is the 2 decks that can kind of gatekeep their way out of it because they go incredibly big, and then there's the rest of the meta that's just either you go to the ground and you're able to beat that, or you're just kind of playing on your own tier 2 beyond. So it lends itself to feeling very, very centralized. And that's why I put so much focus on the fact that, you know, set 1 was a tighter meta. It looked like there was a world in which any class can really succeed. Whereas with set 2, I think the power gap is so much larger. And that's why I'm not even totally in love with the way I'm naming the meta, tier 1, tier 1.5. There's an argument that 0.5s are kind of pointless in tier list discussions, but I like using them. So instead, I think realistically, the meta is this. You have tier 1, which is Discard Dragon, Sword Leonidas, and Abyss Aggro. And then you've got the Gatekeeper tier, which is Ramp Dragon and Aegis Control. Those are decks that exist, that are able to do well against the tier 1, but naturally, because the tier 1 decks are lower to the ground and able to beat out these strategies before the Gatekeeper strategies are able to get online, then they will succeed more often. However, the Gatekeeper decks are so strong that they do force out other decks from this tiering. So effectively, the format becomes, hey, are you a Gatekeeper deck? You're going to have an uphill battle, but you could still have a chance against the tier 1 decks. The tier 1 decks take advantage of the fact that they're the best decks to be able to beat out things like Ram Dragon and Aegis Control, and then you have everything else. I do want to point out, I'm not saying that classes that aren't represented in this aren't good. I think that there's still great strategies. I still love what D-Shift OTK does. I think Earthright is a criminally underplayed strategy. I think Force is coming together as a mid-range class that can really kind of push and get there. And already it was so close to being moderately viable in terms of the scope of the entirety of the format in set 1. And in later formats, we do see that. But at the moment, I think this is where set 2 lives. Now, for what it's worth, there's a lot of room for innovation. They didn't have a ton of tournaments over in Japan, and naturally over in the West, we play differently. So there's a lot of room for things to be a little bit. And I'm very excited to see if any of that innovation will push this graph to looking any different. But that is my meta predictions for set 2, Reign of Bahamut. Of course, it's based on some very limited data, but I think it gives us a good view into what strategies we can start looking, exploring into, and seeing if there's any crevices that maybe other strategies will be able to beat into and carve their way into the meta. But if you guys think I'm absolutely wrong, just let me know in the comments down below. And with that said, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Ciao.